You ready? Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the House Progressive Caucus. It is the last day of February, February 28th, 2003. And we are going to be talking today about a number of labor bills. And so we'll do introductions in just a couple of minutes. But just briefly want to mention that we didn't actually have House leadership today. So the only thing to just sort of report is that we'll start our floor schedules a little bit later, or earlier, starting Wednesday at 1 rather than 3 o'clock and Thursday at 1 rather than 3 o'clock, because we're starting to have more bills come to the floor. I think that's literally the only announcement because most bills are now introduced. I know hopefully Representative Kate Logan's on her way. I just wanted to celebrate her first bill got introduced today. It's I'm looking at 15. This is H15, remember it's H415? 415, yes, H415, which is a minimum wage bill that she's been working hard on. So we celebrate her in her absence, but it's another good labor bill, which again, hopefully she'll get here and can tell us a bit more about what's in that bill. So let's start by doing, because that's such a short piece, usually we spend about 10 minutes on that. Let's go around and do introductions, and then we can go right into it with our guests and the couple bills we want to feature. And then if we have time, we'll mention a few more that are also in the hopper. So I'll start. I'm Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanek. I am the caucus leader for the Progressives this biennium.
And Representative Taylor Small, Assistant Caucus Leader, she and her pronouns from Winooski.
My name's Sarah. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the legislative assistant. I use she, her pronouns. Sorry, I totally skipped you.
I'm happy to introduce myself.
Please.
Yeah, I'm Esme Cole, a representative from Hartford.
I'm Liz. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Vermont State Labor Council.
I'm Carrie Brown, she, her pronouns also. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Commission on Women.
And I'm Alana Tate with the House Clerk's Office.
And Board, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, Bor Yang, and I am the executive director of the Vermont Human Rights Commission. And I wish I could be in that room with all of you today. I'm so sorry that I'm not, but the weather is really bad and the roads are pretty bad this way too. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to show up via Zoom today. Thank you.
Yes, well, we're really grateful for the hybrid way that the legislature now works so people can stay safe and do all the things we have to do. And Esme, you can feel free, as long as you say, we openly allow folks to participate, other legislators, so you're always welcome to ask questions and be at the table, but you do you. Yes, okay, great. So let's dive in. So there's a number of labor bills, many of which have been brought forward by members of the House Progressive Caucus. We are very committed to labor issues in general and economic justice. It's one of the provisions that we talked about in our biennium platform at the beginning of the session to really make sure that we're doing not only meaningful change that benefit folks who have access to a union, but folks who are still either trying to organize a union or where it's even harder, and frankly, just workers who are out there with limited rights and protections in workplaces. So we thought we would start first with talking about H218 and H219, if that's okay, Liz, to put you on the spot first, which are two bills related to organizing unions and that process. And it's mimicked after, we're calling the H219 the Vermont PRO Act, which is protecting the right to organize, mimicked off of some provisions on the federal level. That bill in 2021 did not pass, but we thought we should bring some ideas forward into Vermont. And 218 is sort of a companion bill. It's a long form bill that goes into more detail on one of the provisions within H219. So I don't want to steal Liz's thunder, so I'm going to pass it over to her, and then we can pause and have a little dialogue on that, and then go to H116, which is a bill that Bor and Carrie, I'm sure, will want to speak to, which is around a few other provisions of wage transparency, wage discrimination, our Equal Pay Act that we have, and reliable work schedule. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay. So, and Representative Kate Logan just came. We celebrated your bill before you got here, and we'll fold that in at the end of this conversation, the minimum wage bill. So.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Really excited to be working on these bills with you all. My name again is Liz Medina, and I am the executive director of the Vermont State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, which is our state's federation of labor unions. We represent over 13,500 union members across the state. And we had put together this labor omnibus bill that we're informally calling the Vermont PRO Act, Protect the Right to Organize Act, to address some of the issues we were seeing in our day-to-day experience in trying to support workers and forming unions, which are so crucial to all of the other good legislation that we're trying to do, such as minimum wage laws and things like that. I know of a case, for instance, where workers were trying to form a new union just so they could get the Vermont minimum wage. And that, there's some barriers there. So included in the Vermont PRO Act are 4 main provisions. One of them is good cause termination, which is being introduced separately, and also majority sign up or card check, which is also being introduced separately. So good cause termination. That is basically saying that even if you aren't covered by a union contract, all workers in Vermont must be terminated for a good cause, or what we would call just cause in the labor movement. So you can't be arbitrarily or capriciously fired. And oftentimes in the labor organizing context, employers will find all kinds of excuses and reasons to fire somebody as a pretense to really get rid of them because of their labor organizing. And I have to say, of the dozens of people who have approached me about wanting to form a union, the fear of retaliation and being fired is the first thing that always comes up right in that initial conversation. It's very real for people, even here in Vermont. Also included in the Vermont PRO Act is majority sign-up or card check elections. This would be just for the public sector, but essentially would simplify the union recognition or election process by stating, hey, if you can demonstrate a majority, 50% plus one of workers who are eligible to form a union, want to form a union, just go right to negotiations from there. There's no need to hold a second election, essentially, which gives the employer ample time to conduct a pretty vicious anti-union and union busting campaign. And you'll hear about that in detail if you come to our Senate hearing on the Vermont PRO Act or tune in on Thursday from 9 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. 10:30 a.m. Oh my God, I'm tired. So a lot of people will be able to tell you what those campaigns look like and how those actually affect workers. And also included is simply granting the right to form a union for farm and domestic workers. Those groups of workers historically have been excluded from the workers' rights from the National Labor Relations Act due to a legacy of racism in this country, frankly, and sexism. And we believe that they should have the right to form a union. Having this right is really important because when these groups of workers approach parent unions or labor organizations looking for support in organizing, it's another barrier that a lot of under-resourced and really stretched thin labor organizations often won't be able to overcome or are reluctant to because they don't even have that right in the first place. So it leaves them out in the cold. And another part of the last part of the Vermont PRO Act would be essentially taking the captive out of captive audience meetings. And captive audience meetings are part of a union busting campaign that an employer will embark on once they know that their employees want to form a union, or even do from day one during orientation. I've seen that as well. So basically, these meetings are designed to spread, frankly, a lot of misinformation about what unions are, about what will happen to the business if the workers unionize. Frankly, a lot of times these meetings include threats that are technically illegal, but there's no really way to enforce the behavior of anti-union consultants during these meetings and what employers say. And you'll, again, hear some the details of what those meetings look like here in Vermont on Thursday. And they're also a way for employers to get workers in a room and identify whom they think are the leaders of the organizing effort and pretty much create a list for future retaliation and possible terminations. So they are very good at thwarting unionization efforts. I think, there's some studies that show that they are effective in terms of like tens of percentage points of success rates. I don't have that in front of me. But what I will say is, as far as data about unionization in the United States right now, there's multiple studies, but generally speaking, 60 million workers have stated that they would join a union if they could. Yet in the United States, only 14.3 million workers are in unions. Unions disproportionately benefit those with low and moderate wages, those with lower levels of education, and non-whites. States with higher rates of unionization have less poverty. And expanding collective bargaining rights increases protections for women, people of color, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community in areas where our laws are falling short. And I can speak to personal experience here. I was a steward at the Goddard College Staff Union from 2015 to 2020 when I took my job as executive director. And we noticed there was some gender pay gaps going on at the college. And we pulled all the data into a big old spreadsheet. We accounted for things like seniority, education, job titles, and duties, and found rampant pay gender gaps all across the board. And we were able to do something about it, however, because we actually had a union. And so through our union, we were able to file grievances on behalf of a couple of employees with really egregious wage gaps, talking about differences of $5 between a male and a female identifying employee. And also we were able to look at all the job descriptions and more accurately reflect the duties and education levels for each of them. So there hopefully wouldn't be this kind of skewing in the future. And this is, at a progressive college. So we saw that there. It wasn't necessarily a couple of bad people, but it's just a pattern, unfortunately, in society. And so unions have a big role to play there. I also will just say that I don't know how much more time I have to give you a few more anecdotes here, but I get new organizing leads all the time on a weekly basis, but very few ever result in a successful unionization campaign. So I think since we started collecting leads and tracking them in 2020, only one succeeded. And that was a Sorteria House with AFSCME, and that was a voluntary recognition. Just to give you a bigger sample of data, there's this organizing project called Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. It's a project of the United Electrical Workers and DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. It's a really inspiring grassroots volunteer-led project. Eric Dernbach is one of the researchers and volunteers of this project. And he said over the 2 years of operation, over 3,000 workers have reached out, over 800 had intake calls, and 400 campaigns launched with some organizing activity. And then there were 60 successful campaigns from that as a result. So that's a 2% success rate. So a lot of demand, but obviously workers are facing real barriers in their workplace to get successfully forming a union. And I know for myself personally, I've had several workers reach out to me who wanted to form a union, and they're struggling with so many other life circumstances as well that these barriers really do become insurmountable. The captive audience meetings, the threat of being fired. I've had workers approach me wanting to form a union to address their low wages and other workplace issues who are homeless. These are full-time workers. So this is happening right here in Vermont. And you'll see more of that from the courageous people who will testify on behalf of the Vermont PRO Act on Thursday, 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. I encourage you to tune in. And I hope we can get some of these bills passed because workers really could use some support from their government in forming a union and exercising their rights. So thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I will also just note that full disclosure, I used to be a union organizer in the education field for over a decade in Vermont, and it's used even in public sector captive audience meetings in particular. I can think of one place of employment that still isn't organized yet, where every time they contacted me probably 4 times over those 11 years I worked for Vermont NEA, and every time it would always end because there was a captive audience meeting that they held. It was almost like a playbook by the employer. One of the other pieces, because I think I think when we strengthen the rights of workers and across the board, it helps on a number of different levels. And this might be a good segue into 116, but just to stay on the captive audience piece in particular, those meetings are also used for pushing political agendas and religious agendas and creating a pretty chilly environment and a hostile environment for folks who hold minoritized identities. And so I think naming that is really important, that this isn't just about organizing unions. And I know Liz and I have had this conversation. Sorry, there's a babysitter today who's coming, whose name is Liv, thank goodness. Thank you, Liv, back home. But anyway, to be able to really know that this is really a much more universal protection that we hopefully will be advancing about naming, first of all, what captive audience meetings are and protecting the rights of workers to not be sort of essentially held hostage in those power dynamics in their place of employment, to have to listen to whatever the employer wants to put in front of them. But before we move on, just to my caucus mates here, are there any questions or comments people want to make about those first two bills, the Vermont PRO Act or the accompanying sibling bill that's related to how we actually would define good cause employment rights?
I will just add that those statistics were astonishing and really understanding the barriers to folks organizing. So I really appreciate you highlighting that so clearly and the work that you all have done and continue to do in the field to support workers overall. So I'm really hopeful that we will take some action this year to continue that support of workers.
Thank you.
Anything else, colleagues? So one more time, the public hearing is Thursday. No.
Thursday from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., not all day until 10 p.m.
Epically long public hearing, but
That would be.
it's always the first. And that's with the Senate Committee on Economic Development.
That's correct.
So people
Yes.
can find that, those watching at home can find that you can live stream any committee in the legislature by going to that committee's webpage, and then their YouTube channel will come up and you can watch it live or record it later on. So great. Thank you.
And where's the hearing being held?
Room 27.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for the, yeah.
Just in their committee room.
Their committee
Their
room.
normal committee room. Yep. Great. Okay. Well, let's move on to our next bill in the suite, H116, which is a bill that's improving wage transparency and strengthening the Equal Pay Act, which was passed 20 years ago, and also requiring reliable work schedules and reimbursement for work expenses for workers. So this bill is in-house general, as is the other two bills we just talked about, and all those bills got a walk through last week. Was it just last week? That felt like 4 years ago, but last week, I think. And I know in the room was Carrie Brown from the Vermont Commission on Women. And I know I've also worked with BOR in the past on an earlier version of this bill, especially on those issues of wage transparency and making sure that we are thinking more broadly around how our Vermont Equal Pay Act should look 20 years into what now people, really all the protections and all those minoritized identities that we were talking about before, about the realities what people are facing in the workplace. So, Carrie, can I hand it to you just to sort of?
Sure. Actually, how about Bor go first?
Great.
And I'll
Okay. Oh,
clean up.
okay.
That's all right with you.
Carrie.
We can have a dialogue. Don't feel like you have to do it. We're having a dialogue. Yeah.
Okay, well, I obviously support the work of all of you, and I'm just so proud to be part of this conversation. Definitely H116 is a great bill. I see wage transparency as really about giving women and minorities the tools that they need for negotiation in terms of getting a higher salary and better pay and benefits. You're right that our equal pay laws are antiquated and they need to be amended to add race and gender identity. But I would also consider, and if I were asked to testify on this, to add also disability as well as national origin to the list of protected classes under the equal pay laws. And the other thing is that this particular bill seeks to require some reporting requirements to the Department of Labor. And the gap that I see on this bill is that currently what's required for reporting is what women are paid, what different genders and gender identities and maybe the different protected categories of people would be paid. But it does not capture when women make requests to their supervisors and managers for higher pay and how often those are denied. And because the Human Rights Commission enforces the Fair Employment Practices Act with regards to state employees, I happen to know that the state has what's called a hiring to range policy. But and I believe that some of our research in the past shows that there isn't a huge discrepancy in necessarily what HR is doing in terms of when women make requests to be paid more and that request gets to HR is making that decision rather fairly across the board, but we don't capture the number of women who've made that request to their supervisors and managers at the hiring stage who've already said no to them, and that request doesn't get to HR. And I think it's at that discretionary stage where we don't see necessarily how often women are rejected when they make a request for greater pay and better benefits. And so I would love to see some type of reporting requirement that captures requests made and whether those requests are rejected or accepted. But other than that, this is a wonderful, beautiful bill. I see it definitely moving this work towards equity forward and support it wholeheartedly. And I'm happy to answer any questions too. And if there's time, I'd also love to talk to you about the other wage-related bills that I think are really important, H359 and S103.
Great. Let's go to that in just a minute, Bor. And I should have actually started with just the one thing that Bor did a great bill summary. I should have started with that, Bor, sorry, to cue you up. But the one thing I just wanted that you didn't get a little more into detail. And thank you for those edits, because there's always gaps, right, in drafting these bills. And as you were just describing, the necessity of really looking at more holistically the experience of workers, especially women and people of the global majority, of when they get denied these raises that they're asking for. That literally has happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to probably everyone around this room, and it's invisible. And so it really hides the rampant issues of what's compounding the wage gap for people of the global majority and female identifying folks. I just wanted to just briefly say that just on the wage transparency, and that's the shorthand version, but what this would do would require all employers to disclose the wage and salary information for all jobs for prospective and current employees. So it builds off of the salary history law that we passed way back in 2005 and then updated in 2018, which created some protections for workers who are seeking that information within their place of employment. But this would require it to be posted. So in every job posting, just be transparent around what is being offered. It would also prohibit an employer from disclosing a current or former employee's compensation history without the employee's express permission. And this is a big one about not undercutting someone when they're off trying to, again, make their case for something that's more reflective of how they should be compensated in their next job, wherever they might be going. And then finally, it prohibits an employer from using known compensation information in a negative way when hiring. So if they happen to know because it was public information, they say they were a teacher or something and it's publicly known, this will prohibit an employer from lowballing someone when they're at in the hiring process trying to make headway in economically advancing themselves. So just wanted to define that. Okay. Carrie.
Thanks. Thanks for that overall summary. I really appreciate this bill. It's got great stuff in it. I love the way there's so much packed into it, because the issue of equal pay for everybody is very, very complex. There are lots and lots of different factors that affect it. And there are, the Vermont legislature over the years has done a lot of really good work to try to address it, coming at it from lots of different directions. We have one of the lowest wage gaps in the country, and I think that the legislature gets a lot of credit for that. Then there's always room for improvement. So, so I made this little cheat sheet for myself to try to understand what's currently in law and what this is proposing. So in 2013, we strengthened the equal pay law that has been around since 93, I believe. And this would be, so it's kind of complex, and Bor can definitely explain this better than I can. This is really something for an attorney to explain, but we have anti-discrimination, employment discrimination laws. And so you can't discriminate on the basis of all of our protected classes. But then we have this additional law that's particularly about equal pay that was designed to address the fact that women were historically paid less than men. And so this would be an update to that recognizes that there are also systemic, things in place that are keeping people of color and people with disabilities and people of other protected classes from equal pay. So it's a little bit more, I think, and Board can correct me if I'm wrong, but the general anti-discrimination laws we have address situations where someone is really consciously deciding, I am not going to hire you because, you're a woman. Or I'm going to pay less because you have a disability. Whereas the equal pay law that we have addresses these underlying structures so that even if there is no intention to discriminate, but you set up a system of hiring and a system of compensation that results in, right now, women being paid less, that is still illegal. So I don't know if that kind of, that's very, very rough generalization, but that's a bit of the difference. And so that's really important to understand that, because I think we are going to hear, well, don't we already have laws preventing discrimination again on the basis of race? Why do we need to add it to the equal? So that's a really quick summary of why. And then the other stuff around wage transparency and around salary history, we passed a law a long time ago that you were allowed to disclose how much money you make. And then in 2013, we updated it to include asking other people about how much they make or asking about other people's salaries. So that is also something that as an employee you're allowed to do. Now, if you ask your HR manager, how much does Jane make? They don't have to tell you. But there's nothing preventing them currently from telling you. So one of the questions that I have about this proposed law is the intersection between what's currently protected and what you're proposing to not allow. And so the way that I'm looking at this, employers are prohibited from disclosing a current or former employee's salary. Even if they want to share that, they wouldn't be able to under this proposal. And I think I don't have any kind of complex analysis of this or anything, but I think it's worth thinking about how does that interact with employees' right to know what people's wages are and to talk about their own wages and to inquire about them. And that we all benefit from wage transparency, which is a fundamental premise of this bill. And so we want to make sure that we're not putting up additional barriers to wage transparency that might conflict with what we already have or just work against the goal of more transparency, while at the same time protecting people from the kind of lowballing offers that you're talking about and from salary history being used against people. So we have in current law that an employer can't require that that salary history be provided. They also can't say that it has to meet certain criteria. Like you can't say, well, if you weren't making at least $30,000 a year in your past job, I'm not going to interview you because this is a $100,000 a year job or whatever. So it gets the current law a little bit gets at that idea of not using someone's salary history negatively, but this would strengthen that even farther. And then I think those are the comparisons that, and I agree with Bohr that if we're going to add race and gender identity to the equal pay law, we should think about adding in others as well. And I think that disability and national origin are good ones to go with. And then just one word about the data reporting piece. We have a constant challenge with insufficient, inadequate data of all kinds. A lot of it exists, but isn't being regularly collected or reported. So that's an interesting piece for us to keep in mind. There was a time, and before my time in this job, in the past of the state, when the state of Vermont was really good about collecting data, had lots of people whose jobs it was specifically to be collecting and reporting data, and that most of that was gone in the, if anyone remembers, challenges for change.
Oh God, I hadn't thought that phrase in a while.
Yeah. We lost a lot of that back then. But there's a lot of data that just is still kind of there and not really getting reported. But data about wages is, we don't have a reliable source for getting what this bill is trying to get at. And so asking for regular reporting from employers would really be extremely helpful. I think as you know, there's going to be a ton of resistance to this on the part of employers, but it would be really helpful. There is currently a method for getting some of this by gender through the unemployment insurance reporting that is not well enforced or it's better than it used to be. The Department of Labor is much better about it than they used to be, but there are also ways that a bit of pressure could be applied on current systems and current agencies and to give the data that they do already have or should be collecting in case this doesn't happen. But this would be really helpful.
Right.
So I think that's all I wanted to say about this one.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Before we move on to just committee discussion, I don't want to not mention the last couple of provisions in this bill, which is about reliable work schedules for workers, right? Which also disproportionately impacts women, female identified folks, as well as people of the global majority, because unreliable work schedules often show up in service and retail jobs, which are predominantly held by those folks I just mentioned. And so what this bill would propose is requiring an employer to provide a worker's schedule posted no later than 14 days before the first day of their next work shift. And that obviously really helps folks who are trying to find reliable childcare, folks who are trying to do a second job, which many Vermonters have to do, especially in low wage work, or all the other hosts of things we try to do in our lives. And it is actually a rampant issue. I don't have the statistics in front of me at the moment, but it's a rampant issue with many folks often getting a day, 2 days, sometimes not even just on the same day. Changes in their schedule, or since COVID in particular, businesses or employers just shutting down for the day, stopping a work schedule and shorting people hours because there's just not enough customers coming in. And right now, nothing prohibits in state law, nothing protects, I should say, the worker for getting paid for that time, et cetera. And so this piece of the bill would start to really grapple with that reality, so folks aren't losing out just because customers aren't coming to the door when they thought they had a full day's work ahead of them. And then the last part is around reimbursement for work expenses. This started just as an idea from a constituent. Shout out to my constituent who brought this to me in the height of COVID, when remote work was sort of an early thing. Now remote work is a permanent thing for a lot of sectors, and there's this cost shift that has happened where now employers are no longer, some of them, having a bricks and mortar office location, but people are working remotely and having to pay for their own internet, computer, et cetera. In certain situations, maybe some employers are providing that, but those are all pieces required to do their job. And then there's the ongoing issue where folks have uniforms or other things necessary for their work, and there's pretty limited laws that require an employer to pay for that. It's really only if you're deducting it from someone's wages, and it can't fall below minimum wage, for example. But beyond that, these are things you need to actually do the work that benefits the employer, not the employee necessarily. So this is a proposal that we require the employer to actually reimburse for things required to do that work, like items. So just to be thorough there. Caucus, whatever, what is my name today? I don't know. There's a lot on my brain. Any comments on 116 or observations about that bill? Bora, was that a finger?
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to
Please.
what Carrie said?
Yes.
Carrie, you're absolutely right. And I thank you for bringing that up about sex discrimination versus equal pay laws, is that under equal pay laws, you don't have to prove intent. You don't have to show that your employer was intentionally discriminating against you. It is a much better claim to bring for wage discrimination. Under sex discrimination, wage discrimination, you have to show that your employer was intentionally discriminating against you, and that's really difficult to prove. At some point, maybe in the future, I hope I'm not throwing a wrench into things, but one of the things that needs to be improved about our equal pay laws is that there's still an out for employers. One exception to unequal pay is that an employer can demonstrate that they have some other legitimate business reason for why they pay people differently. And that is articulated so generically that it allows an employer to say, because we have this policy about looking at people's past wages, or we have this policy about this or that allows them to get away with paying people differently. And so it's something worth considering. I would also say that the reason why we add race and color and national origin and disability, it isn't just to add these separate groups of people as if people exist in separate groups of protected classes. It captures women of color. It captures women with disabilities. It captures transgender women. And our sex-based laws in history have traditionally been about progressing women who are white and straight and cisgender moving their work forward and not capturing women who fall in these intersecting identities. Right now, a woman of color who can point to another white woman who's doing the same job as her cannot bring an equal pay law claim. And that is really sad. And so when we add race here, we're saying you get to bring that claim and you don't have to prove that your supervisor was intentionally discriminating against you. So I just wanted to add that piece.
That's really powerful, Bor. Thank you for saying that, because the intersectional nature of identities, of course, compounds issues of wage discrimination, wage pay gap, et cetera. And actually, the point you made about I forget the legal term, but the bona fide economic reason, that phrase for employer, it just perked my ears up, because in H218, we actually get into a definition there around good cause termination. So I wonder if there's something there that can be sort of woven together, because that bill idea came out of a bill in Illinois that still hasn't passed yet, but there is some language in there, because that has often been also the loophole that employers get to use to say, well, this is why I'm laying you off. I just can't afford, but I'm keeping my cousin on, like it just really starts to really look at creating due process within the workplace. And that piece, I'll just flag that. I think Liz wanted to jump in, and then I want to leave a little time for Kate's bill and Bor, just for you to give us a little preview of those two other wage bills you mentioned. Did you want to jump in, Liz?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Just taking some notes. So yeah, I think this is really important. Just, tailing on the story that I told earlier, we were able to get wage transparency among our bargaining unit members, which was, part of having a union and really helpful in that regard. One thing, though, we've always struggled with is getting transparency from management salaries and, seeing what was happening there at that level, which we weren't entitled to they eventually conceded to give that information in aggregate form. So I'm wondering, how will this be publicly accessible data for workers who don't have unions? Would it include management salaries and wages as well?
Yep, and that's the intent. I mean, it's a starting place. I hate saying that phrase. This bill's a starting place. I have some PTSD around that. But anyway, for the data collection piece, it was at least getting the idea, because as Carrie was saying, not anything pretty organized or helpful is collected now. So it's just starting that idea of like, this is all wages and salary for all positions for an employer with 10 or more employees is the starting place. And of course, beyond that, we can go. So
that's great.
Yep.
Can I just add a couple things? I just wanted to follow up on what Bor was saying about that bona fide business related reason. Back in 2013, when we changed the equal pay law, that was the big thing that we changed, because the law said something like any other reason. And we changed it to a bona fide business related reason. And that was a huge, big deal. And getting that change in place took a lot. And it's just so interesting to me that here we are 10 years later and we're like, yeah, that wasn't really, didn't really do that much. And it needs to be looked at again. So I really appreciate you bringing that point up, Bor, because it's still pretty tough. And then the other thing is Bor's going to talk about these two other bills, which are incredibly important. And I just want to stress that and emphasize that the bills that she's going to talk about have the potential to make a really transformative difference in the lives of people working who are experiencing harassment and discrimination at work. So
great.
Tell us about those.
So Bor, yeah, let's do that. We have about 5 to 6 minutes left before we have to hike back through the snow to the State House. And I want to give Representative Logan 2 minutes to just mention her minimum wage bill. So don't mean to rush you, but can we spend maybe 2 to 3 minutes on these other wage bills, and then we'll give the last couple minutes to Kate. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I shouldn't have called them wage bills. They're workers' rights bills.
Even better.
Yeah. And I can't help but want to say that wouldn't it be wonderful if we just articulated what bona fide legitimate reasons are and then put them in the statute? Like, I'd love to hear from an employer about what are your bona fide reasons for why you pay women differently from men. And then and if we agree, then we'll put that in the statute rather than saying, come up with them in the future and let a court decide that. All right, so 359 and S103 are really companion bills. And the two most important things that they do is, the first is it stops punishing people for bringing forth claims of discrimination in the workplace by employers entering into agreements that says it will settle with you, even though you brought a meritorious claim, we'll settle with you, but you have to agree never to work for us again. It's called the Don't Darken My Door bill. And we need to stop punishing people by allowing employers to negotiate and use that as a negotiation tool. We see that the state of Vermont is using that in cases that are meritorious, where employees are good employees, and they're using it just so that they can pay them less for their discrimination claims. And when you have a large employer like the state of Vermont that employs over 8,000 people, that's very problematic to say you will never work for us again. We are essentially saying leave the state. The other important piece of the bill is that we need to change the way that we see harassment in the workplace, but also in our schools and places of public accommodations. And right now, the legal standard for harassment is called severe or pervasive. And we have had so many cases that have suggested that what has happened to women in the workplace is not severe enough, or it hasn't occurred long enough for it to be pervasive. So this is about correcting a legal standard that has gone awry and creating a new standard in Vermont for how we look at harassment in the workplace. The other thing, and it goes hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier about intersecting identities, is that our courts are really terrible at how they analyze harassment against a woman who falls within multiple protected classes. And so if a woman with a disability who is also a woman of color is subjected to sexist comments and racial slurs and derogatory statements around her disability, she must prove that each of those things is severe or pervasive, but the courts don't look at all of those things in totality. And so we need to amend our laws so that the courts are required to look at the totality of circumstances in terms of whether or not she is subjected to a hostile environment. We changed that last year in our housing anti-discrimination laws, and we were able to find discrimination occurred in a housing case where a woman was subjected to comments about her disability, comments about her receiving public assistance, and a lot of horrible comments about her sex as a woman. And that never would have made it to a final determination that discrimination occurred if we hadn't changed the law. So this is about changing the way that we look at harassment in the workplace and in places of public accommodations like schools.
Yes, and yes, and yes, 1,000 times yes. I can't even believe that this isn't law already. I mean, sometimes when we talk about these issues, I shake my head. It's 2023, and how in the world have we not really thought about this? And I think it just goes to point that a lot of the people in the State House bring privileges, right, where they have not experienced this themselves, and so it becomes less of a priority. Sorry, that's a soapbox moment, but we will work on this this session. So let's give the last couple of minutes. Thank you, Board, to Representative Kate Logan, and give us a little idea about your first bill. We're so excited. H415.
Yeah. Well, Carrie, we worked on minimum wage together for a while. So Representative Jubilee McGill, who's also really involved in the minimum wage campaign last time around, and I co-sponsored a bill. We have 20 sponsors, which I was really happy with, considering the bill would make a significant change to the minimum wage to make it equivalent to basic needs budget livable wage for a single person, which in 2023 is $19.45 an hour. Then it also has a study in there. I learned a fact that Sweden has the highest rate of successful entrepreneurship on earth, and it doesn't surprise me because people have what they need and can take more risk because they don't have to provide their own health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So it also has a section to authorize a study to determine the best conditions for entrepreneurship, and then a small business payroll grant program to help businesses that would, that operate on already tight margins and are small businesses operating in Vermont, which we know do a lot for our communities, to be able to afford to pay workers a livable wage. And we have two other minimum wage bills in the House. this session. It also eliminates a bunch of exemptions to the minimum wage for domestic workers, et cetera, like John Kalacki's bill. So I told him we'd put that bill into our bill. And then there's Chip Troiano's bill that would eliminate the tipped minimum wage. And then Representative Bloomley also put a bill forward that would take a look at how the livable wage calculation is made by the Joint Fiscal Office. So they're all kind of companion, they're kind of all, it would be nice for them to all be taken up together. If we're going to base the minimum wage on the livable wage standard for a single person, we want to make sure that that's meaningful. Other states are just, kind of like rounding up. Massachusetts is going to go for 20. I've heard that New York State advocates are asking for $21.50 an hour. So we're on trend with the change in the minimum wage advocacy movement in the country and in the region. But yeah, I hope it gets some attention this year. Gonna beg Tom.
Great.
To do so.
Thanks, Kate. And the basic needs budget bill, which I can't think of the number, is getting active testimony in House General. I've been noticing that. My own interest in that from many decades ago when I first started working in economic justice. So a piece of this might be moving forward, which of course connects to H415. Great.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts before we hike through this? It's pretty, but it's probably not fun to drive in. Pretty snow that is falling outside. Any other final thoughts? Okay, well, thank you again to our guests from the AFL, from the Human Rights Commission and Vermont Commission on Women for coming and engaging with us in these conversations about these bills and trying to, as we do in these caucuses, try to really just elevate that these bills exist among the hundreds that have been introduced and why they are so critical for working people in Vermont. Great. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you so much.
you.
For your